Yeah, so there towards the end, y'all were really getting after what feels to me so important about having this conversation, which is that we live in a society and in a culture, and myself personally, like growing up in a very small town, rural, evangelical type of worldview, it was there's the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it, and
Yeah.
God's people have always tried to do it the right way with varying degrees of success, but it's always been that way. When in reality, what most of us think of as traditional family values is very much the minority across all time and culture, not just as we're discussing, proto humans and ideas that span millions of years. But even if we look back to like the Leave It to Beaver 50s and things, across the pond, things were looking very, very different. Even here in America, things were looking very different from that story that we were telling ourselves. And all of this is not to be prescriptive. If you want 2.5 kids and a white picket fence, by all means, like, do
Sure.
that shit.
Sure.
But the notion that you are failing because you have not achieved, a marriage to your high school sweetheart with two children that lived happily ever after is just asinine. And we beat each other up and we heap so much shame on ourselves for failing to live up to a standard when that standard isn't even like a ideal worth striving for. It's just one equally important or unimportant way of being. I mean, how does
Oh
all
yeah.
that grab you?
I completely agree. Is that we live in a society of people who are having their bi-monthly panic attack because they haven't had their kissing Jake Gyllenhaal in the rain at the other end of
Right.
an airport terminal, that all that they haven't had this crazy moment that they saw in XYZ movie. And like, it's just because that's not it's not that that isn't a real thing. It's just like that's a very rare and not reasonable thing. And also, you don't really need that. And also, there's a lot of wonderful other things. And like,
Mhm.
just people try to hold themselves to these weird standards. And when we look back, even across there's this really cool sexologist. She is a, oh god, I'm gonna forget her name off the top of my head. It's like I'll give it to you later on, and if you can put it in
Sure.
something. But she just did a TED talk about this. She's fantastic, and she's on TikTok as well, and she does kinky history. Um, and she talks about different people in throughout history. James Joyce, the one of the greatest writers of all history, the father of classical literature and all this stuff. She reads a poem that he wrote to his wife about how much she farted one evening and how hot it was, and just, your ass was full of farts, my little whore, and I fucked them all out of you. And like, he goes on to describe all of these different farts in all these beautiful flowery ways. And then Mozart had, he wrote songs about lick my asshole and all the, which you can call jokes, but probably weren't. And then, you've got Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the founders of the Enlightenment that we credit with the foundation of America and all this stuff. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote at length about his desire to be spanked and dominated by a woman dressed up as his mother. It wrote all about it because that was what he was into. And we just
Mhm.
don't talk about that. We don't. And
Yeah.
you can tie into one thing that I've talked about a few times before, and it happens to be in the same person who, god damn, I'm gonna find her name before I move on. But like, the is fetishes, especially foot fetishes, are like the most common fetishes in the entire world. And she here it is. Her name is Esme Louise James.
Mm.
Look her up. She's fantastic. She's a PhD candidate and she does kinky history. But foot fetish is the most common in history, all the time, and there are people who have tried to find biological underpinnings for it. One of them was this oh, I can't remember the scientist's name off the top of my head, but noticed that the somatosensory cortex here in your brain, where you can map out a homunculus of what parts of your body have experiences on different parts of your brain. Well, it just so happens that the part of your brain that feels your feet and toes is bumped right up against the part of your brain that feels your genitals. And
Mm.
so the idea was like, you can cross some wires here, so to speak, and both in perception and in touching. And also, we can notice that during the great STI outbreaks throughout history, big gonorrhea outbreak, big syphilis outbreak, whatever, foot fetish porn goes through the fucking roof.
Sure.
And like there's an intrinsic link there. Um, and sometimes it was even displayed as like the safe alternative to
Yeah.
vaginal sex that you could like, and so like these are things that we can draw psychological lines to and we can draw biological lines to, but we can't escape the reality that they're persistent and completely
Mhm.
engross our entire society. Our entire, for lack of a better word, human history is deeply penetrated with kink and with weirdness and with sex just purely for pleasure. And we can't get away from that, and we can't pretend like there's a normal way to do things because there just fucking isn't.
And a lot of what we've been trying to do tonight is to like run those things to ground and to try and have some explanation for it. And on a, if we step away from like the large sociological or even like anthropological lens and just look at ourselves, I think there's that same temptation to be like, well, what does my, Pornhub search history say about like my childhood experience? And you know what? There might be some value in deconstructing those things. And I do think that you can find some interesting things about yourself and maybe
Mhm.
put together like, oh, I had this traumatic experience that now I'm trying to like gain some mastery and control over. Or, maybe when I was young, I had this erotic experience that I didn't fully understand. And now I am fascinated by it and I keep coming back to it. And those ideas, when they show up, are really interesting, and there's nothing wrong with pursuing that. But for the most part, I think that people can drive themselves crazy by trying to come up with solutions to these things. And oftentimes it's okay to just let an open question be an open question. Like, why do we have boobs? I don't know, but they're fantastic, and I'm just going to appreciate that they're here.
Right, exactly. And I think that's especially important when you're talking about, like your personal, like, why am I into this type of thing? Why do I want this type of thing? Why do I feel this type of way? I think it should be a lot more acceptable to, yeah, sure, explore the answer as much as you want to. That's fine. But don't be afraid of the answer being who cares.
Yeah,
It
sure.
doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Like, if you're having fun and like, I feel like a lot of people, I think we might have touched on this last time I was here, but it's worth repeating that like, most people I feel don't ever have the opportunity to really ask themselves the questions of like, am I really straight? Am
Mhm.
I really cis? Am I really into this? Am I really not into that? Um, they don't give themselves the opportunity to explore and to apply logic to their bizarre sexual perversions,
Right.
and also to remove logic from their bizarre sexual perversions and see what they are without it as well. And like just kind of just bask in the warm, weird glow of their own sexuality and sexual identities. I think that if a lot more people gave themselves the opportunities to do that, you would probably see a lot more people be a lot more accepting of themselves and a lot happier. And I would give as evidence of that concept is like when we poll homosexuality in the population, or any kind of what we would call deviant sexuality back in the day. There was a time when being homosexual was considered a mental disorder. And then we looked out and we found, oh fuck, over 1,500 different animal species exhibit homosexuality. Turns out it's a thing that can just kind of happen. And like, oh, who knew? And then all of a sudden overnight we reprinted the DSM, and everybody, like millions of people, were cured of mental disease all of a sudden. Wow, how amazing, right?
Mhm.
And when we look at polling number, when we try to track homosexuality, sure enough, it seems to increase in the poll numbers. And we have to ask the question, are there more gay people today, or are more people comfortable saying that they're gay to a stranger in a white lab coat asking them about who they're porking? You know what I mean?
Right,
So
yeah.
like that's when we take that stigma away and we allow people to express themselves,
I mean, when
especially
we
express
let
themselves.
kids have left-handed desks, all of a
Yeah,
sudden we meet all these
exactly.
left-handed kids. Right.
Exactly, exactly. It was of the devil. It was evil. It was sinful. It was wicked. People were beaten because they wrote with their left hands. And then we were like, "Hey, some people are left-handed. Guess we better just let that be a thing." And now it's cool. And it's the same thing with homosexuality. And I think, if we had a more open and inclusive society as a whole, I'm sure that if we were to repoll people in 20, 30 years, it would look like, oh my God, bisexuality is on the rise. And, no, actually, people are just kind of realizing that there's interesting stuff all over the place. And here's a fun fact: huge percentages of straight people in straight relationships have bisexual fantasies or homosexual fantasies all the time, because there's a difference between sexual orientation and erotic orientation and
Hmm.
romantic orientation. You have your sexual orientation, what you're actually wanting to have sex with, your romantic orientation, the kind of feelings that you have, and the erotic orientation, which is just what gets you off, even if that isn't something you actually necessarily really want in your real life. And for lots of people, those three things are the same thing. And for lots of people, they aren't. And so, like, if we allow people to just be themselves and express themselves and not say, oh, I got off to this, now I'm this kind of person now, just, just you did, and it's cool. Have fun with it. Like, that's fine. Just be cool with yourself.
Yeah, yeah, and to that point, I guess I just really want to express that acceptance is a bird with two wings, right?
Yeah.
There's the piece where you have to see something as it is and be able to like recognize and see something clearly rather than projecting onto it what it should be or having some heuristic on what things ought to look like. But the other piece of it is love and compassion, like a willingness to enjoy or find pleasure in whatever you find there. Back to that Carl Rogers idea of it, the curious paradox. It's not until I accept myself as I am that then I gain the ability to change or to at least work through some of these things. And so we live in a culture and in a society right now where there is violent enforcement of a lot of particularly gender norms.
Yep.
I would like to think that within 50 years, we will laugh about homophobia the same way we do just now on people who are left handed. And we'll just recognize, no, no, that's part of our bodies.
Yep.
But it's also important to recognize that right now we are violently enforcing back to that idea earlier of your biology is everything you can be, your culture is what you are allowed to be and what you're not constricted to be. It just scares me a little bit to see, so many armed folks breaking up drag shows. And, of
Yep.
course, there was everything that happened at Club Q. I don't know. I don't mean to ramble overly much, and I don't mean to ask you to predict the future, but how do you feel things are sort of trending in terms of this information that you and I are discussing tonight and this idea of biology is weird, bodies are weird? Does that seem to be permeating the culture? Does it seem that 50 years from now we'll be laughing about some of this ridiculousness?
What gives me hope and what makes me happy is that, my parents and grandparents were the hippie peoples, the ones that are out there. My grandparents, I have on one side that were in the resistance fighting against Nazis in Austria, and on the other side I've got grandparents who signed up to teach the first integrated classrooms and to have integrated doctors offices and like trying to fight against segregation there. And then my family has a long history of being on the right side of history,
Mm,
uh, and what gives me hope is that the things that they talked about, the kind of message that they talked about that was so much counterculture of the time, of acceptance and love, not tolerance. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be
sure. Yeah.
loved and accepted. You know what I mean? Of this integration of society with allowing people to be themselves. That same message is still being carried on today, only it's actually exponentially growing, and it's got so much wonderful traction because people like you in our age group, you or mine, we are now finally at the time where we can have the clout and the leverage and the position, the authority to be able to help make these changes. And we've got Gen Z's crazy ass backing us up. You know what I mean? Like that's
Sure.
they're ready to fight with it. And so like I see this amazing trend of possibility, of advancement, of compassion. Um, and I see it growing exponentially. It's not just a one issue at a time anymore. It is vast swaths of people that we're going to help now. We are now going to ameliorate society for all LGBTQIA plus. We could just use the word queer. Everybody who isn't cis and straight and all these things. And anything that goes against, and we're also going to ameliorate society for all black and brown people, and we're also going to look at all BIPOC. We're just going to bring in everybody indigenous too. We're just keep bringing in more and more and more, and you get confronted when you talk about armed terrorists at drag shows. You're confronted with this idea of woke, which is,
Right.
I've yet to find someone who can. I don't know if you heard about this. I used to make fun of people and say you can't define what woke is, but somebody actually did. Ron DeSantis fired a lawyer
I
for being
caught
too
that.
woke.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the lawyer was sued him. Was like, all right, define woke then. If you can't tell me what it is, you can't fire me for it. And they defined woke as believing that there is systemic injustice in America that needs to be addressed. So if you're a fucking election denier and a MAGA hat guy, you're woke now because you think that the election was stolen. Isn't that fun? But this is, if you can deal with reality, if you can look around us and see that, anything that goes against the cisgender, heterosexual, white, European, patriarchal hegemony is called out as being woke. If you can identify that, then, I think you're on the right side of history. And if you're
Yeah.
willing to
Fair to
work for
say.
it and fix it, then yeah, I think you're doing the work that we need. And I see more and more and more and more people just very easily able to look around them and identify that things are not as black and white and cut and dry as we like to pretend that they are. And
Hmm.
lots of people have lots of problems, and we all have a role to play in making things better. So you didn't ask me to predict the future. My future is my prediction is a good one. I think.
Hey, yeah, no, that's deeply encouraging. I'll definitely take it.